Section 1 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 1, by Isaac Disraeli. On the Life and Writings of Mr. Disraeli, by his son, Part 1. The traditionary notion that the life of a man of letters is necessarily deficient in incident appears to have originated in a misconception of the essential nature of human action. The life of every man is full of incidents, but the incidents are insignificant because they do not affect his species. And in general, the importance of every occurrence is to be measured by the degree with which it is recognized by mankind. An author may influence the fortunes of the world to as great an extent as a statesman or a warrior, and the deeds and performances by which this influence is created and exercised may rank in their interest and importance with the decisions of great congresses or the skilful valour of a memorable field. M. de Voltaire was certainly a greater Frenchman than Cardinal Fleury, the Prime Minister of France in his time. His actions were more important, and it is certainly not too much to maintain that the exploits of Homer, Aristotle, Dante, or my Lord Bacon were as considerable events as anything that occurred at Actium, Lepanto, or Blenheim. A book may be as great a thing as a battle, and there are systems of philosophy that have produced as great revolutions as any that have disturbed even the social and political existence of our centuries. The life of the author whose character and career we are venturing to review extended far beyond the allotted term of man, and perhaps no existence of equal duration ever exhibited an uniformity more sustained. The strong bent of his infancy was pursued through youth, matured in manhood, and maintained without decay to an advanced old age. In the biographic spell, no ingredient is more magical than predisposition. How pure and native and indigenous it was in the character of this writer can only be properly appreciated by an acquaintance with the circumstances amid which he was born, and by being able to estimate how far they could have directed or developed his earliest inclinations. My grandfather, who became an English denizen in 1748, was an Italian descendant from one of those Hebrew families whom the Inquisition forced to emigrate from the Spanish peninsula at the end of the 15th century, and who found a refuge in the more tolerant territories of the Venetian Republic. His ancestors had dropped their Gothic surname on their settlement in the terra firma, and grateful to the God of Jacob, who had sustained them through unprecedented trials and guarded them through unheard-of perils, they assumed the name of Disraeli, a name never borne before or since by any other family, in order that their race might be forever recognized. Undisturbed and unmolested, they flourished as merchants for more than 2 centuries under the protection of the Lion of St. Mark, which was but just, as the patron saint of the Republic was himself a child of Israel. But towards the middle of the 18th century, the altered circumstances of England, favourable as it was then supposed to commerce and religious liberty, attracted the attention of my great-grandfather to this island, and he resolved that the youngest of his 2 sons, Benjamin, the son of his right hand, should settle in a country where the dynasty seemed at length established through the recent failure of Prince Charles Edward, and where public opinion appeared definitively adverse to persecution on matters of creed and conscience. The Jewish families who were then settled in England were few, though from their wealth and other circumstances they were far from unimportant. They were all of them Sephardim, that is to say, children of Israel, who had never quitted the shores of the Midland Ocean until Torquay Torquemada had driven them from their pleasant residences and rich estates in Aragon and Andalusia and Portugal, to seek greater blessings even than a clear atmosphere and a glowing sun, amid the marshes of Holland and the fogs of Britain. Most of these families, who held themselves aloof from the Hebrews of northern Europe, then only occasionally stealing into England as from an inferior caste, and whose synagogue was reserved only for Sephardim, are now extinct, while the branch of the great family, which, notwithstanding their own sufferings from prejudice, they had the hardihood to look down upon, have achieved an amount of wealth and consideration which the Sephardim, even with the patronage of Mr. Pelham, never could have contemplated. Nevertheless, at the time when my grandfather settled in England, and when Mr. Pelham, who was very favourable to the Jews, was prime minister, there might be found, among other Jewish families flourishing in this country, the Villarreals, who brought wealth to these shores almost as great as their name, though that is the second in Portugal, and who have twice allied themselves with the English aristocracy, the Medinas, the Laras, who were our kinsmen, and the Mendez de Costas, who I believe still exist. Whether it were that my grandfather on his arrival was not encouraged by those to whom he had a right to look up, which is often our hard case in the outset of life, or whether he was alarmed at the unexpected consequences of Mr. Pelham's favourable disposition to his countrymen in the disgraceful repeal of the Jew Bill, which occurred a very few years after his arrival in this country, I know not. But certainly he appears never to have cordially or intimately mixed with his community. This tendency to alienation was no doubt subsequently encouraged by his marriage, which took place in 1765. My grandmother, the beautiful daughter of a family who had suffered much from persecution, had imbibed that dislike for her race which the vain are too apt to adopt when they find that they are born to public contempt. The indignant feeling that should be reserved for the persecutor in the mortification of their disturbed sensibility is too often visited on the victim, and the cause of annoyance is recognized not in the ignorant malevolence of the powerful, but in the conscientious conviction of the innocent sufferer. 17 years, however, elapsed before my grandfather entered into this union, and during that interval he had not been idle. He was only 18 when he commenced his career, and when a great responsibility devolved upon him. He was not unequal to it. He was a man of ardent character, sanguine, courageous, speculative, and fortunate, with a temper which no disappointment could disturb, and a brain, amid reverses, full of resource. He made his fortune in the midway of life, and settled near Enfield, where he formed an Italian garden, entertained his friends, played whist with Sir Horace Mann, who was his great acquaintance, and who had known his brother at Venice as a banker, eat macaroni, which was dressed by the Venetian consul, sang canzonettas, and notwithstanding a wife who never pardoned him for his name, and a son who disappointed all his plans, and who to the last hour of his life was an enigma to him, lived till he was nearly 90, and then died in 1817 in the full employment of prolonged existence. My grandfather retired from active business on the eve of that great financial epoch, to grapple with which his talents were well adapted, and when the wars and loans of the Revolution were about to create those families of millionaires in which he might probably have enrolled his own. That, however, was not our destiny. My grandfather had only one child, and nature had disqualified him from his cradle for the busy pursuits of men. A pale, pensive child, with large, dark brown eyes and flowing hair, such as may be beheld in one of the portraits annexed to these volumes, had grown up beneath this roof of worldly energy and enjoyment, indicating, even in his infancy, by the whole carriage of his life, that he was of a different order from those among whom he lived. timid, susceptible, lost in reverie, fond of solitude, or seeking no better company than a book, the years had stolen on, till he had arrived at that mournful period of boyhood when eccentricities excite attention and command no sympathy. In the chapter on predisposition, in the most delightful of his works, Essay on the Literary Character, Volume 1, Chapter 5. My father has drawn from his own, though his unacknowledged feelings, immortal truths. Then commenced the age of domestic criticism. His mother, not incapable of deep affections, but so mortified by her social position that she lived until 80 without indulging in a tender expression, did not recognize in her only offspring a being qualified to control or vanquish his impending fate. His existence only served to swell the aggregate of many humiliating particulars. It was not to her a source of joy or sympathy or solace. She foresaw for her child only a future of degradation. Having a strong, clear mind, without any imagination, she believed that she beheld an inevitable doom. The tart remark and the contemptuous comment on her part elicited on the other all the irritability of the poetic idiosyncrasy. After frantic ebullitions for which, when the circumstances were analysed by an ordinary mind, there seemed no sufficient cause, my grandfather always interfered to soothe with good-tempered commonplaces and promote peace. He was a man who thought that the only way to make people happy was to make them a present. He took it for granted that a boy in a passion wanted a toy or a guinea. At a later date, when my father ran away from home, and after some wanderings was brought back, found lying on a tombstone in Hackney churchyard, he embraced him and gave him a pony. In this state of affairs, being sent to school in the neighbourhood was a rather agreeable incident. The school was kept by a Scotchman, one Morrison, a good man, and not untinctured with scholarship, and it is possible that my father might have reaped some advantage from this change. But the school was too near home, and his mother, though she tormented his existence, was never content if he were out of her sight. His delicate health was an excuse for converting him, after a short interval, into a day scholar. Then many days of attendance were omitted. Finally, the solitary walk home through Mr. Mellish's park was dangerous to the sensibilities that too often exploded when they encountered on the arrival at the domestic hearth a scene which did not harmonize with the fairy land of reverie. The crisis arrived when, after months of unusual abstraction and irritability, my father produced a poem. For the first time my grandfather was seriously alarmed. The loss of one of his argosies, uninsured, could not have filled him with more blank dismay. His idea of a poet was formed from one of the prints of Hogarth hanging in his room, where an unfortunate wight in a garret was inditing an ode to riches, while done for his milk-score. Decisive measures were required to eradicate this evil, and to prevent future disgrace. So, as seems the custom when a person is in a scrape, it was resolved that my father should be sent abroad, where a new scene and a new language might divert his mind from the ignominious pursuit which so fatally attracted him. The unhappy poet was consigned like a bale of goods to my grandfather's correspondent at Amsterdam, who had instructions to place him at some collegium of repute in that city. Here were passed some years not without profit, though his tutor was a great impostor, very neglectful of his pupils, and both unable and disinclined to guide them in severe studies. This preceptor was a man of letters, though a wretched writer, with a good library, and a spirit inflamed with all the philosophy of the 18th century, then 1780 about to bring forth and bear its long-matured fruits. The intelligence and disposition of my father attracted his attention and rather interested him. He taught his charge little, for he was himself generally occupied in writing bad odes, but he gave him free warren in his library, and before his pupil was 15 he had read the works of Voltaire and had dipped into Bayle. Strange that the characteristics of a writer so born and brought up should have been so essentially English, not merely from his mastery over our language, but from his keen and profound sympathy with all that concerned the literary and political history of our country at its most important epoch. When he was 18, he returned to England, a disciple of Rousseau. He had exercised his imagination during the voyage in idealizing the interview with his mother, which was to be conducted on both sides with sublime pathos. His other parent had frequently visited him during his absence. He was prepared to throw himself on his mother's bosom, to bedew her hands with his tears, and to stop her own with his lips. But when he entered, his strange appearance, his gaunt figure, his excited manners, his long hair, and his unfashionable costume only filled her with a sentiment of tender aversion. She broke into derisive laughter, and noticing his intolerable garments, she reluctantly lent him her cheek. Whereupon Emile, of course, went into heroics, wept, sobbed, and finally, shut up in his chamber, composed an impassioned epistle. My grandfather, to soothe him, dwelt on the united solicitude of his parents for his welfare, and broke to him their intention, if it were agreeable to him, to place him in the establishment of a great merchant at Bordeaux. My father replied that he had written a poem of considerable length, which he wished to publish, against commerce, which was the corrupter of man. In 48 hours confusion again reigned in this household, and all from a want of psychological perception in its master and mistress. My father, who had lost the timidity of his childhood, who by nature was very impulsive, and indeed endowed with a degree of volatility which is only witnessed in the south of France, and which never deserted him to his last hour, was no longer to be controlled. His conduct was decisive. He enclosed his poem to Dr. Johnson with an impassioned statement of his case, complaining, which he ever did, that he had never found a counsellor or a literary friend. He left his packet himself at Bolt Court, where he was received by Mr. Francis Barber, the doctor's well-known black servant, and told to call again in a week. Be sure that he was very punctual, but the packet was returned to him unopened, with a message that the illustrious doctor was too ill to read anything. The unhappy and obscure aspirant who received this disheartening message accepted it in his utter despondency as a mechanical excuse. But, alas! the cause was too true, and a few weeks after, on that bed, beside which the voice of Mr. Burke faltered, and the tender spirit of Bennet Langton was ever vigilant, the great soul of Johnson quitted earth. But the spirit of self-confidence, the resolution to struggle against his fate, the paramount desire to find some sympathizing sage, some guide, philosopher, and friend, was so strong and rooted in my father, that I observed a few weeks after in a magazine an original letter written by him about this time to Dr. Vysemus Knox, full of high-flown sentiments, reading indeed like a romance of Scudery, and entreating the learned critic to receive him in his family, and give him the advantage of his wisdom, his taste, and his erudition. With a home that ought to have been happy, surrounded with more than comfort, with the most good-natured father in the world, and an agreeable man, and with a mother whose strong intellect, under ordinary circumstances, might have been of great importance to him, my father, though himself of a very sweet disposition, was most unhappy. His parents looked upon him as moonstruck, while he himself, whatever his aspirations, was conscious that he had done nothing to justify the eccentricity of his course, or the violation of all prudential considerations in which he daily indulged. In these perplexities the usual alternative was again had recourse to: absence. He was sent abroad to travel in France, which the peace then permitted, visit some friends, see Paris, and then proceed to Bordeaux if he felt inclined. My father travelled in France, and then proceeded to Paris, where he remained till the eve of great events in that capital. This was a visit recollected with satisfaction. He lived with learned men, and moved in vast libraries, and returned in the earlier part of 1788 with some little knowledge of life, and with a considerable quantity of books. At this time Peter Pindar flourished in all the wantonness of literary riot. He was at the height of his flagrant notoriety. The novelty and the boldness of his style carried the million with him. The most exalted station was not exempt from his audacious criticism, and learned institutions trembled at the sallies whose ribaldry often cloaked taste, intelligence, and good sense. His odes to the academicians, which first secured him the ear of the town, were written by one who could himself guide the pencil with skill and feeling, and who, in the form of a mechanic's son, had even the felicity to discover the vigorous genius of Opie. The mock heroic, which invaded with success the sacred recesses of the palace, and which was fruitlessly menaced by secretaries of state, proved a reckless intrepidity, which is apt to be popular with the general. The powerful and the learned quailed beneath the lash with an affected contempt which scarcely veiled their tremor. In the meantime, as in the latter days of the empire, the barbarian ravaged the country, while the pale-faced patricians were inactive within the walls. No one offered resistance. End of section 1.